Reader, I know it must be very difficult for you to believe this, but two things. One, I am new to making YouTube videos. This is a skill I'm currently teaching myself. I know you look at these videos and you think, is this a Ken Burns project? Did Steven Spielberg have a hand in creating Allison's Ramblings? No, I'm self-taught. Two, it will shock you to learn that I do this all in one take. Just one take. And then I go back into iMovie. You didn't ask about my process, I realize, but I feel I need to share this with you. I go back through iMovie and I snip apart. Holy shit, what the fuck was that? Change. My mother said that since I was a little child, like before I even had money or use for currency, I would always be dropping change. Like when I was still in diapers, I always had change. And to this day, you can find me. Follow the path of change on the ground. You'd think I had money with all the fucking change I dropped. Anyway, I'm not thinking about this a whole lot. It's a hobby for me while in between jobs, processing my divorcement from my ex, who left me for a gay YouTuber in Vermont. Facts is facts. Apparently the Robert Frost thing is going to have to be a two-parter because I read you The Road Not Taken in the last episode, and episode. I'm already referring to my videos of episodes. Look at me making YouTube videos like everyone else can. But I kept thinking about Robert Frost, and here's what I want to say. If you are watching this and you enjoy the poetry of Robert Frost, if you have those last lines that I discussed in the last video of the road not taken tattooed on your arm, or perhaps across your heart, maybe you have Robert Frost lines tattooed on your arms. I see some people get writing on their arms. My jury's out on the writing on the arms with the tattoos because, of course, I love language. I just don't know. It might overstimulate me. Anyway. Back to my obsessing on a single topic for long periods of time. I have autism. What am I going to do about it? And Robert Frost. If you like Robert Frost, you got him tattooed, you got a framed work of his lines of poetry on your wall at home somewhere. No shade, no judgment, no hate. That's the great thing about art. At least I've always found it to be the great thing about art. I think we can safely disagree upon art. I think we don't have to enjoy the same art and we can still get along just fine and still think of each other as good people and smart people and people worth knowing, even if we don't share the same taste where it pertains to art. I've been fascinated by writing and reading and language since I was a little girl. Autism, maybe. And now I've grown as a teacher to obsess over things beyond words. Beyond words. That could be the title for my next memoir, Beyond Words. I'm just kidding. That's a fucking stupid title that maybe Robert Frost would have put on one of his chapbooks. Beyond Words. I want to tell you about Robert Frost. His work, I think, is grossly overrated, not good. And yet it is continued to be regarded in at least K through 12 settings, if not beyond. I don't know what's going on in colleges anymore. Fell off the college horse, fell right into public education, just in time for the pandemic. The Road Not Taken is trite. It's a duh poem. Our choices have consequences. I don't need a poem to tell me that at this juncture. Maybe people back then when Robert Frost wrote The Road Not Taken in 1915, maybe we Americans were just dumber. We didn't know our choices had consequences. It seems like a classic white apologist move, if you ask me. Like, we didn't know slavery was bad. You knew. Y'all knew. We didn't know Jim Crow was happening. You knew. So, like in the poetry world, like, we didn't know Bob Frost sucked. No. Very safe artist. I like art that challenges taboos. I'm talking about my personal preference now. I'm talking about my personal aesthetic. I like challenging taboos, and even in my life's philosophy, I like fucking challenging taboos because taboos are largely just sacred secrets. And one of the things I've discovered in working on myself and getting better, you wouldn't think seeing me sitting here rambling about Robert Frost on a gorgeous Sunday, it's a long weekend, Sunday, that I had my affairs up here in order, but actually I do more so than I've ever had my affairs up here and in here in order in my entire life, and even physically in order. Body, septin for the cancer. I talked in the last video how Robert Frost read at Kennedy's inauguration, and I did a little homework after that video. I said something to the effect, not to the effect, I said, where he walked from the podium at Kennedy's inauguration into his casket. That's a bit of an exaggeration. He died 2 years later, almost exactly to the date, Robert Frost. So Robert Frost gave a reading at Kennedy's inauguration and then was dead 2 years later. Do you think the Kennedys killed him? Do you think it was Bobby? It's something to do with Marilyn and Atomic Secrets? I'm going to make that documentary for Netflix. Robert Frost was killed by the Kennedys. The story of Robert Frost's inauguration is better than I had anticipated. My friend Mr. Levin and I used to watch, not all the time, but occasionally we'd review Robert Frost videos and readings, and we were trying to do it with an open mind because we were good teachers and we wanted to come to our subject matter with an open mind. I mean, lots of Americans like Robert Frost. My hair is doing something crazy. My hair is like one of those pillows where you can like zhuzh it one way and it's like sequins, and then when you zhuzh it the other way, it's, I don't know, number 7 or something. So Robert Frost read at Kennedy's inauguration. Oh, I did want to show you, reader. No, that's not what I want to show you. I keep pulling that book up. This is actually a fascinating book that I'm reading right now. Book plug. Look what I found when I was going through divorcement boxes. Western Wind. I am sure is going to have some Bob Frost in it. Oh, it has. This was from my undergraduate years. This was a text. I was an English major, and I went on to get an MFA in writing. So I made a life out of thinking about Frost-like matters, but not Frost specifically. So look at how much Frost is in this freaking anthology. That's all that shit. That's all Robert Frost. Maybe I should use this instead of my computer to read to you. Oh my god, there's so much Robert Frost. What's on page 26? It's probably just about how Robert Frost was great. I'll hear from Robert Frost. And this is just an example of like great quotes in Western literature. I'll read the ones from Frost. I farm a pasture where the boulders lie, as touching as a basket full of eggs. Ellipses. Dot, dot, dot. The attic wasps went missing. The attic wasps went missing by like bullets. Maybe it was radical at the time. I want to point out that contemporaries of Bob Frost included T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats, who are truly two of the greatest poets in the West who maybe ever lived. If you want to read old poetry written by dead white guys, dead Europeans, read you some Yeats. I'll read you some Yeats later as comparison to Bob Frost, and maybe it'll drive the point home of why he's grossly, grossly overrated. It in my heart when I was a child. Sometimes in English classes I was bored. Sometimes that was because I didn't understand, but sometimes it was also just because I felt like I already knew. A poem about, well, take for example, The Road Not Taken. A poem about our choices having consequences. I did not need to study on that message by the time I was 18. Shit had gone down in my life. Like, by the time I hit 18, and then had to study Robert Frost because I was getting a BA in it. I was going to put it in quotes. I did get a BA in English. I studied the fuck out of English. I had great English professors, in undergrad especially, who taught me how to read like a motherfucker. My annotation is off the hook. I don't drink anymore, and so like I don't have anything to really do at parties, and nobody ever asks me like, hey, Grubs, we annotate a bunch of shit while we get wasted. No role at parties anymore. In any case, Robert Frost. So he gave a reading at Kennedy's inauguration because of course he did, because he's considered like one of the greatest American poets and one of like the American poets. So he gave a reading at Kennedy's inauguration. He was very old, and he had written a poem originally called. He'd written a poem originally for the occasion of Kennedy's inauguration called. Wait for it. He called the poem Dedication. He was educated at Dartmouth. He went to Yale, supposedly great schools of great minds. And the best title he could come up with for Kennedy's inauguration was Dedication. I mean, if a friend asked me to write a poem for their birthday, one, I'd feel awkward about that, so don't do that. But two, if I accepted the offer, I certainly wouldn't call the poem Happy Birthday if I'm trying to pass myself off as a poet. And like if you're reading at a presidential inauguration, supposedly you're good. Amanda Gorman's good. I enjoyed Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem, this whenever that was. Time feels very strange. We all know this. So he wrote a poem called Dedication. I'm not going to read all of it because I read through it earlier and it's boring as fuck. It's a very pedantic, jingoistic, propaganda prose poem. I did not end up reading Dedication, which he wrote for the occasion. Dedication. So clever. You called this inauguration poem Dedication? Wow! So impressed, Robert Frost. Anyway, he didn't read Dedication, but I'll read you a little bit from it. Dedication. This is what he wrote for Kennedy's inauguration, but did not read, and I'll tell you more about why in a second. Summoning artists to participate in the August occasions of the state seems something artists ought to celebrate. Today is for my cause a day of days. And his be poetry's old-fashioned praise, who was the first to think of such a thing. The rhyming, and this is where I really think, like, no rhyme, Robert Frost, fuck off with the rhyming. I told my students, my young writers, like who were serious writers, like the ones who really like had a thing, I said, don't rhyme in your freaking poems, it's too limiting. And I think this is true for novice poets. They shouldn't be taught rhyming poetry to start. I'll have to think of that one. But if you're a serious studier of language and you're over the age of 15, ditch the Robert Frost, ditch the rhyming, sow your wild poetic oats. Don't write like Robert Frost. So that was from Dedication. Boring, double thumbs down, and it goes on forever. Like if I had to read this to you, this video would be like 4 hours long. It's really boring. Alas, it was very sunny on the day of Kennedy's inauguration. And we've mythologized Kennedy and the Kennedys to this point where ancient Greek literature level mythology, sunny day upon Kennedy's inauguration. And I'm not just saying Kennedy, whatever. I mean, whatever. They were rich white people. Story of America. Anyway, he didn't end up reading that poem, Dedication. Even though it sure was a doozy. It was a doozy, but it wasn't, wasn't really my taste. So Bob Frost didn't read Dedication at the inauguration because it was too sunny, and his old eyes couldn't handle it. He couldn't squint at his shitty poem. No shade. I mean, I am blind, man. I'm the real McCoy. As I got more blind in my older age, I've always been blind, since I was in third grade. I established this last night at a family gathering. I got glasses when I was 7. It made me super popular. Let me tell you. It's fun to be the first kid in your class in the 1980s to get glasses. Anyway, my eyesight is horrendous. Off of phones, I hate reading off of computers in a public reading, public performance, public speech-giving situation, but I have to because my eyes are so bad. Robert Frost was the same way, and the light was in his face. He couldn't read Dedication. What a shame. What he did, gotta hand it to him. He just recited a poem of his own from memory. And the poem he recited from memory was a poem that he wrote called The Gift Outright. And I'm going to read this poem to you now. This is the poem that Robert Frost did read slowly, uncomfortably, at Kennedy's inauguration from memory, because the glare was too great for him to see the text of the new poem he'd written for the occasion called Dedication. Why didn't he just call the poem Occasion? Why didn't he just call the poem Inauguration? Why didn't he just call the poem Speech? So instead he recited from memory this poem, which is much more short than Dedication, which thank God for the audience who was there that day. They dodged a bullet called Dedication. They dodged it, but they got this instead from old Bob Frost memory. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by. Possessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak. Until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living. And forthwith found salvation and surrender, such as we were gave ourselves outright. In parentheses, the deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, you got that right, Bob Frost. America, it can be artless. Unenhanced, such as she was, such as she will become. Boom. Short, sweet, 8th grade poetry. Well done, Robert Frost. Wrap it up, get off stage, go lay down in this casket. It's jingoism, it's propaganda, it's bullshit. You know, Frost was a propaganda poet, unlike Yeats. You heard me read that. I don't know if you were moved. Maybe you're very patriotic and you're like, yeah. Dedication was like all jerking off on Columbus and shit. So it's probably a good thing for his own legacy that he didn't read Dedication. That he recited from memory, which I think is hilarious. It'd be like, so I have a couple books. I'm not trying to brag. Sometimes this idea actually terrifies me that there are 2 print books of my thoughts in the world. I did it. It wasn't like a book just happened to me. It wasn't like, oh shit, I wrote a book. No, it's not like that. I did this to myself. Bad thing, but it's, you know, sometimes a stressful thing. So anyway, it would be as though a friend said, oh, Gruber, I just love the essay Speaking to Strangers from You're Not Edith. Would you please read that at my funeral? And so I get to the funeral, and it's dim in there. Oh, fuck. Oh my God, I can't read this. And I know this person really wanted me to read this for their funeral. It's a big, important occasion at the end of one's life. Can't read. Dang it. So instead of like asking for a prop, and I'm sure there were props at the Kennedy inauguration, helps instead of getting another pair of glasses, instead of taking out my, you know, well, he didn't have a cell phone, but, you know, instead of trying to figure out a way to make it happen, I just went, oh, okay. I remember a little bit of how to play ragtime on the piano, so we're just going to pull in this piano, and I'm just going to do like a bar. Do 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 do. Thank you. I mean, that would have had the same impact, for me at least, that Robert Frost poem that he did ultimately read at Kennedy's inauguration would have had on me. So Frost was a contemporary of Yeats. And I just want to read you a Yeats poem that I think about all the time now. It's always been very pertinent to the moments of our American lives, but and our global lives, but I like this one. And so this is a contemporary of Frost. I want you to think about the fact that we force American children to read Frost, who was an American. Yeats was an Irishman, but, you know, tomato, tomato. There are some shitty American poets. There are shitty Irish poets, I'm sure, but the Irish tend to pump out quality literature. That's been historically true. This is Yeats' The Second Coming. Just compare to anything of Bob Frost. Compare it. This is actually a good poem. Grim, but good. The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. That sounds familiar. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image of our Spiritus Mundi, it's been a minute, did I read Spiritus Mundi? Troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it, real shadows of the indignant desert birds, the darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Kennedys were Catholic, Kennedys were Irish. Why didn't they have Yeats read this poem at Kennedy's inauguration? It would be a great inaugural poem for whoever is the next president of the United States. Read The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. I want to conclude this by saying one nice thing about Robert Frost. He wrote one poem that is okay, and it's kind of in the vein of Yeats. And the poem's called Fire and Ice. It's very short, which I appreciate because Frost has a tendency to be very long-winded because he loves the sound of his own rhyming skills, which, if you compare them to like the rhyming skills of a rapper, that's the real rhyming poetry that's coming out of America. Just FYI, like 1,000 years from now, if the planet still makes it, I think American students will be reading rap lyrics from this century and late last century. That's rhyming. That's how you do it. Robert Frost. It was like Robert Frost is rhyming on crutches. Rhyme. So Fire and Ice, poem by Robert Frost, I am okay with. I sometimes used it in middle school classrooms when I taught middle school intro to creative writing. It was a safe poem for middle schoolers. As are all of Robert Frost. I mean, shit, if you're worried about what your kid's reading, give them a fuck ton of Robert Frost. Granted, they'll never want to read again, which would be a damn shame, but they're not going to get exposed to any new, edgy, interesting, complex, intriguing, unusual, fascinating ideas of Robert Frost. It's like reading a saltine cracker. A slave of saltine crackers. Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. Fire and Ice. Bob Frost. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. I hold with those who think the poem could have ended at that point. But he goes on. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destructive ice... fucked it up. I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. I get it. The word great takes me way out of the poem because, okay, this is like emo Robert Frost. This is Robert Frost feeling some like not so happy feels or not so calm old man in a sweater relaxed feels at Yale, teaching God only knows what to students who then went on to do this more. The poem could have ended at, from what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. It gives me plenty to think about, but no, he's got to push it. And then that word great. I know he probably doesn't mean it like great, he means it like great, but you know, this is a problem with teaching old poetry in K-12 public schools, developing readers and thinkers and writers. They got to do like all this translation to understand the connotations of a word as it's being used almost 100 years hence. Prior. And so you're making them like, oh, what did great mean in 1804 versus what does great mean in 2022, and then how do I... It's a lot. But if you're studying American literature, you have to study this because this shit was foisted on us for God only knows how long, because he was the American poet. Maybe it was. America is like a slave of saltine crackers sometimes, in terms of the culture we produce. That's all for today, hooligans. Be good.
I didn't know what to tell her. I had a dizzy feeling in my head. Then she took a look at my palm. She said, "Sonny, you feel kind of warm."